Okay, so quick background on this film, since more than likely very few of you have heard of it, especially if you're from outside of Europe. This is probably one of the most, if not the most expensive Arab film ever produced. Budgeted at about $55 million and backed by the chairman of a major communications company over in Qatar. It was based on a late 1950s novel by a Swiss author who had also had a career previously as a driver, and it was the first film in 4 years from French director Jean-Jacques, who you might best know from Enemy at the Gates, Two Brothers, and The Name of the Rose. Got all of that? Well, history time's over. Now let's get to the movie. That movie nut here with a review for Black Gold, or as it's alternatively known, Day of the Falcon, the 2011 desert epic starring Antonio Banderas, Mark Strong, Tahar, Rahim, and Freida Pinto. Set in the 1930s, the story centers on two warring tribes whose sultans, Nasib and Ammar, decide to call a peace pact, who have been fighting over a piece of land called the Yellow Belt. Ammar must hand over his children to Nasib, who in turn promises to take care of them as if they were his own in return for peace. As the children grow up, an American geologist discovers there is oil in the Yellow Belt and convinces Nasib to start mining for it, thus violating the agreement and opening up new conflict. And in the middle, one of the boys, Aouda, now grown up, is torn between the modernization of his adopted father and the tradition and old ways of his true father. The actors all around turn in good performances, but given the setting of the story and the obvious ethnicity that will require, there is a couple of things I have to bring up. Banderas and Strong are good in their roles as the respective sultans, though unfortunately Banderas' heavy accent does mean he doesn't blend in quite as well as Strong does. His silkier, more smooth accent and voice does contrast a bit too sharply with a lot of the other male actors who speak in a much more gruffer manner, and their accents are not as pronounced. Despite this, Banderas still turns in a good performance as a man who is eventually led astray by his desire for money, and becomes caught up in something bigger than himself. However, between the two big names, Strong is the stronger actor here, no pun intended. Aside from being able to blend in a lot better, he also seems to embrace the material a lot more. He has a commanding screen presence, and you buy him as this wise but also stubborn sultan. As for the younger actors, Tahar Rahim is Aouda, our main lead, and he does a good enough job, and his transition from being a little bit of a nerdy bookworm to a desert warrior certainly is pulled off well. However, Freida Pinto is in a pretty thankless and almost minor role as the princess and therefore de facto love interest. Compared to her work in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which came out the same year, the role just doesn't give her a lot to do. Most of the time she just sits around or stands around looking pretty and making googly eyes at Tahir. However, later into the film, another bright spark is introduced in the form of Reese Ahmed as Dr. Ali, who easily gets some of the funnier and more meaty material in the film, not having to speak a lot of the official and sometimes melodramatic dialogue. He gets to have a lot more fun with the role, sort of being a desert eccentric, and he plays off well with Tahar. Visually, this is where the film earns its biggest points. To put it in simple terms, the film is stunning to look at. The desert is photographed beautifully, and the action scenes are shot and edited tightly, giving them an intensity and energy that fits the grand scale that the story is clearly trying to aim for. And the fact that it's a period film also affords a lot of beautiful costumes, sets, and vehicles. And the score by Baron James Horner is not exactly a shy down either. And while it may not be his strongest work, it certainly fits the film well, incorporating some Arab instruments and music, including a sparingly used but neat little choral section, whilst mixing that in with your traditional Hollywood orchestra for these kinds of epics, underscoring a lot of the action perfectly, whilst providing a nice bit of ambience to the more standard desert scenes, giving them an almost ethereal quality, fitting in with the religious nature of some of these characters. But putting all that gushing aside, let's get to the meat and potatoes here, the script, which was also co-written by the film's director, Jean-Jacques. And, well, this kind of film is the definition of a mixed bag, or rather a mixed bag of two halves. What I mean when I say that is, on the one hand, the first half is the weaker part of the film. It's very clunky, the dialogue doesn't sound very natural, it very much suffers from that problem that Gods and Generals and the Alamo and a lot of historical epics tend to have, where the dialogue just feels like it was ripped from a textbook. It doesn't flow very well when it comes to conversations, or it just feels too info-dumpy, as if it's telling us a little more than necessary, and it just doesn't feel right. It also doesn't help that when we see the American characters who come to help with the oil, they are pretty much nothing more than cartoon characters. I mean, I'm pretty sure that more than a few of them even had Yosemite Sam mustaches. They're loud, they're burly, they drink. It would be a bit, well, simplistic to say that there isn't at least the faintest trace of an anti-US sentiment here. And that further detracts from the humanity of the first half, and it makes it difficult to really engage with these characters despite the fact that there is a lot of stuff going on. You have this very tempestuous peace pact between these two groups. You have children growing up in a house that isn't technically their own, and you have a man, Nezib, who's being presented with wealth that he has probably never seen before in his entire life. That could, in theory, make for really compelling storytelling, but the film's clunky dialogue and its somewhat slow pacing doesn't let this happen. And as a result, for the first maybe 40 to 50 minutes, you'll probably sit there wondering, where is this going? Is this going to do anything remotely interesting? Or am I just going to sit through what amounts to a walkthrough of the book? However, around the 50-minute mark is when things start to pick up, which is, I would say, marked by a scene where we see Mark Strong's character sit down with Tahar and talk about his relationship with his mother. Here, the dialogue decides to step down a bit, to be a bit more lax and flow better. The emotion starts to resonate a little bit more. And from there, the film starts to pick up. And not too long after that, we get our first big desert battle. And then, of course, Reese Ahmed's character comes in and starts to inject a little bit of life and humor into the film. And that has a knock-on effect as soon Tahar's character, Aouda, starts to also get a little bit of lax and freedom himself, and he has better interaction, especially in this half when he has to work with a group of criminals to try and fight Nasib's forces, all of whom were equipped with brand new American weapons. The actors have chemistry here, the dialogue has a little bit more fun, it's a little bit more lax, and it creates a little bit of energy that the film is badly needing. And when you mix that in with some really good action, some really good music, the second half really picks up and it starts to feel like, okay, now Anaud has a better grasp of what he's doing. And it certainly makes the film, at the very least, entertaining. But even with that, it still makes you sort of wish, wow, I really wanted this film to be more. Or rather, I should say, this film is leading you to think that there's going to be more. With ideas like that, and with very much a kind of story that really is not all that different from what would have really happened during the early days of the oil business, there's a lot of interesting ground and ideas to cover here. But Nasib is reduced to pretty much an idiot, and the Americans are reduced to cartoon characters, so it's very difficult to really get any interesting perspective. And because Freida's character is given very little to do, the love story that they try and push in here doesn't really work that well, and it just comes across as filler. And yet, in spite of all of this, I don't hate the film. The first half has many problems, sure, but somehow the second half just is enough going for it to the point where, in all honesty, it didn't really bug me as much as it would have. Not that that excuses it, but at the very least Arnaud managed to round things out and at least sort of balance it out. And so I must give Black Gold a bronze star. Given the fact that you can find it pretty easily on DVD or for streaming, it's worth checking out at least once just for the beautiful visuals and great music and even a couple of good performances. But unless you're a die-hard fan of Arnaud or any of the actors in this film or have an interest in Arabian history and maybe want to check this out for novelty, there are many other options such as Lawrence of Arabia out there for you to consider.